Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for virtual Bulldogs Behind the Scenes, featuring an exclusive look of the Geneva Bible. Well, my name is Molly Kelvin, and I'm from the University of Minnesota Duluth Alumni Relations team. Today, we're going to take a peek at the world's first study Bible, the Geneva. Now to introduce our guest. We are fortunate to have Dr. Krista Sue-Lo Twu with us today. Dr. Twu, Associate Professor of English at UMD, received a PhD with a specialty in medieval religious literature at the University of California, Irvine, and additional work in paleography, codicology, and medieval Latin at the University of Notre Dame. At UMD, Dr. Twu teaches courses on early British literature, Chaucer, Shakespeare, material book history and culture, King Arthur, and the history of English language. In October 2016, she brought Shakespeare's first folio to UMD in collaboration with the Folger Shakespeare Library and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Her current research focuses on Boethius, Chaucer, and paleography, and she now serves as the president of the Duluth Interdisciplinary Chirographic Technology Association. It is now my pleasure to welcome and hand it over to Dr. Twu.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here again. Thank you for coming. Today, we're going to look at some of the Geneva Bibles, actually, all of the historic Geneva Bibles in the Ramseyer collection, and talk a little bit about the age of descent and the conditions of their creation and their dissemination transmission. The Ramseyer collection was brought to UMD. The Ramseyer collection is named after the Reverend Henry E. Ramseyer, and it contains more than 1,800 volumes in over 140 languages. These texts are really special. They're historic. They are a terrific record of the use of these texts through the history of people of faith, and also in academic and intellectual settings. So they really preserve the historical record of families and communities of faith, and they help us explore the past and make these connections among many threads of history: personal, spiritual, social, linguistic, literary, and material. They used to be held by the Northern Bible Society, and you can see the building that they occupied here. Photos from around 1965, courtesy of Tony Dearkins, UMD alum, and the Xena City Press, which celebrates historic Duluth in the Western Lake Superior region. So thanks to Tony Dearkins for sharing that with us. And then they came to UMD in 1979 with the help of Daniel Munt and Don Pierce, who was then the head of the library, the director of the library. So there's a register that we have that I hope you'll come up to the fourth floor of the library and see it sometime, that contains a record of the volunteer founders of the Bible Society that starts with the beautiful large signature of Henry Ramseyer, and continues to show what a living legacy this is. The register itself only recently came to the UMD library, so it's a nice new document to see. And here you can see that when I say a living legacy, I mean that we are continually studying this collection. These displays are up on the fourth floor of the library, and they're almost all student work. Students are involved in curating these beautiful displays based on their coursework in linguistics and book history and literature and all sorts of things. So, I really hope that you can come and visit the fourth floor of the library and take a look at them. Also, I'd like to give special thanks to Matt Rosendahl and Amy Brown, the library director and the UMD Archivist, for all of their work, keeping this collection, making it available, working with our students to help students understand how to use and care for and preserve and display these beautiful materials. We really couldn't do our work in the university without them. I'd also like to give a thank you to the work and the penumbra of the Klaus P. Jankowski Fund for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. This fund connects campus and community, students and scholars across disciplines, across the ages. It's a truly interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary opportunity with a lecture every year and a writing prize that highlights student work. So a lot of the work that we do with the Ramseyer collection is implicitly made possible by the support and the interests that are brought to it through the Jankowski Fund. So moving to the Bibles, and I wanted to start with a little bit of an explanation and a history. A lot of people ask, why is this English translation called the Geneva Bible? What does Geneva, Switzerland have to do with an English Bible? So in this section, I'd like to give a brief history. What is it? What are we talking about? Protestants, Puritans, Geneva. In effect, I want to talk about how the Reformation both made and then broke the Church of England, and of course also remade it again too. So our first key figure and key term is Martin Luther, and many Minnesotans are Lutherans because many Minnesotans are Germans and Scandinavians, and he's a big deal. He's a theologian, a composer, a priest, a monk. He started out Catholic, and as many of you already know, he was, in a sense, responsible for the Protestant Reformation. Now, you notice he was Catholic, and he didn't really intend to break from the church. He just had some questions. He had some concerns, and his main objective initially was to reform the church. And so this is partially where the term Reformation comes from, right? He posted these questions and concerns in the form of 95 theses that called for debate and called for reform. The legend is he nailed them to the church of the door of the church in Wittenberg, and for his efforts a few years later, he was excommunicated from the Catholic Church at the Diet of Worms and declared an outlaw by the Holy Roman Emperor. He nonetheless had a happy and long life. He eventually married a former nun and had many children and loved children, and translated the Bible into German in between 1522 and 1534. Sometimes people call that translation German Bible the German King James Version the German King James Bible, because it's so beautiful in its language. It's true that his teachings formed the basis for this protest and this reform. But the word Protestant itself was originally a term of derision. Like I said, he didn't intend to split with Catholicism. He really intended to reform. He called himself a reformer. Catholics called him and his followers Protestants because they thought they were thought to act in protest. So eventually, they really did have a sectarian split, and his ideas proved incompatible with Catholic doctrine on the points of salvation by grace alone, a priesthood of the faithful. So he was against sacerdotalism. He thought that anybody could have direct access with God, and that the sacraments were not necessary. And he was a great proponent of the Bible as the only source of divinely revealed knowledge. He didn't think that it was necessary to be, that the theologians, the catechism, the church fathers, not even the Pope, was the ultimate source of divinely revealed knowledge. So these are the basics of his teachings. The effect that it had in England was interesting. And we covered this in the presentation on the King James Version last time. So you may remember that King Henry VIII had a pretty dramatic split with the Catholic Church in the 1530s. And again, the split, Henry VIII also was a pretty devout Catholic, and he didn't really want to split. But when it came, push came to shove, Luther's ideas about the priesthood of the faithful and the status of the Bible itself diminished the Pope's authority and provided theological grounds as well as political motivations for the church in England to split from the Roman Catholic Church. And this is where we link with the Geneva Bible. So by 1531, Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had not produced a male heir, and she was too ill to conceive again. She was also about 10 years older than he was, so they were running out of time. He wanted to put her aside, divorce her, and remarry. But the Catholic Church had denied him an annulment of their marriage. So he was very desperate for an heir, and it ended up with his repudiation of the Pope and a declaration of himself as supreme head of the Church of England. So he ordered Archbishop Cranmer, and that's a name that will come up again, to void his marriage with Catherine, which had the knockoff effects of making their daughter Mary illegitimate. And you can see this image here is of Henry VIII's Great Bible, sometimes called Cranmer's Bible. And in it, you can see Henry enthroned at the top, handing these Bibles to the Archbishop on the left and Thomas Cromwell on the right, where they then distribute to the people, and everybody at the bottom is saying, Vivat Rex, long live the king, which was great. This is actually, this Great Bible was actually the first authorized Bible for the Church of England. So I know we think about the King James Version as the authorized version, but it was only one of the authorized versions. So Catherine has to leave court. Mary is raised away from court, a devout Catholic. And these circumstances give her particular reasons to despise Protestants. And so, as you know, Edward VI did not get to reign for very long. And when she, Mary, succeeded Edward VI as the monarch, she reinstated certain Catholic practices. She very much encouraged Catholicism again and brutally persecuted Protestants. So we call this period the Marian Exile. She became Queen Mary I, and she married Philip II, who was king of Spain, Portugal, Naples, and Sicily, and under the doctrine of jure uxorius, right, the law of the wife, he also became king of England. Now, the English, they despised Philip II. They hated having a foreign king. This is the first time they had a foreign king since Canute, the Dane, back in the 500-600s. It's been a long time, and it was hugely controversial. This doctrine of jure uxorius also is part of the reason why Elizabeth never married. So, there's long-term historical consequences here. So Mary, although she issued a proclamation that she would not compel any of her subjects to follow her religion, she also imprisoned many of the leading Protestant church officials, including Thomas Cranmer. And she abolished all of Edward VI and Henry VIII's religious laws, and she returned the English church to Roman Catholic jurisdiction. If you were an Anglican priest, who had married, because as you know, Anglicans, Episcopalian clergy are allowed to marry. She stripped your benefice from you. You could no longer be a priest. She tried to restore all of the church property, but Parliament thwarted her. And a couple generations later, this is actually going to lead to a rift that creates the conditions of the English Civil Wars, this conflict between the monarch and the Parliament. Finally, although she, said that she was okay with people being Protestant, not being Catholic, she actually did have 283 religious dissenters burned at the stake, including Thomas Cranmer. This earned her the nickname Bloody Mary, and truly even the Spanish Inquisition thought that she was being a little rough. So about around 800 very prominent and also very wealthy dissenters fled to Europe, and around 200 of them ended up in Geneva, where they very much got radicalized by John Calvin. We think of John Calvin as the kind of father of Puritanism, and we often think of Geneva as a Puritan Bible. And yes, it did start off as a product of this English community who was being really inspired by the teachings of John Calvin. But I want to make it clear that the Geneva Bible was everybody's Bible when it hit the market. It was tremendously popular. It had huge widespread appeal, and it was way less expensive than a lot of the other Bibles, and conveniently in English. So John Kelvin, you know him perhaps as a leading figure in the Protestant Reformation. He was a very controversial preacher, a polemicist, a theologian. He was also Catholic, born in France, but he broke with the church in around 1530 and fled to Switzerland and ended up leading the church in Geneva, which was then the Republic of Geneva. So when these English Protestants came to Geneva, they not only got a taste of John Calvin's brand of religion, they also got a taste of Republican thinking, right? They didn't have a monarch, right? So Calvin preached over 2,000 sermons in Geneva, and his signature theological doctrine, predestination, and the absolute sovereignty of God and salvation or damnation of the human soul is really a radicalization of Luther's teachings. It was very influential in the community that came to create the Geneva Bible. This is the Reformation Wall in Geneva. It's a modern monument. It was erected in 1909, but it shows some of the main characters here: William Farel, John from the left, Farel, Calvin, Beza, and Beza was the author of much of the marginal commentary that was included in the Geneva Bible. So, all the commentary, some study aids were very much based on his work. And then John Knox, who those of you who are Presbyterian perhaps remember as one of the founders of the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. So these are all contemporaries, and Knox was very involved in the Bible as well. So why are they called Puritans? This is another thing that we think about. Again, they didn't call themselves Puritans. These were just the English who were protesting or wanting to reform the Church of England. They thought the church hadn't distinguished itself from Catholicism enough, and they were very concerned that Mary was, her explicit agenda was to return control of the Church of England to Catholic, into the Roman Catholic fold. But much like Lutherans, they didn't really intend to break with their church. They just wanted to reform it. And Puritan itself was another one of these terms of derision that the Anglicans gave to the dissenters. They called themselves dissenters, or sometimes they called themselves nonconformists. but they more often called themselves the godly or God's children or even professors. So, Puritan as a term is meant to sort of characterize this group as extremists. It actually comes from this letter that John Calvin was writing in a conversation with John Knox and William Whittingham, who was one of the main translators of the Geneva Bible, regarding the use of the English Book of Common Prayer in this religious group's church services and practices and writing. So he says, in the liturgy of England, I see that there were many tolerable foolish things. By these words, I mean that there was not that purity which was to be desired. I cannot tell what they mean, which so greatly delight in the leavings of popish dregs. So that purity which was to be desired is the key term that their detractors sort of like caught on. And what popish dregs was Kelvin talking about? Things like, Christmas. For the next 100 years, the Puritans, as we so call them, were the first warriors against Christmas in the war on Christmas. And they really did ban Christmas because it was, they thought it was popish. It was too Catholic. They deemed it a sacrilege, the exchanging of gifts and greetings, dressing in fine clothes and feasting, and similar satanical practices are hereby forbidden. And they would fine you 5 shillings, which is ironically about the same price as the Geneva Bible. All right. So that's a nice little notice from the Boston colonies. Now, the Geneva Bible itself came in 2 waves. They first translated it in 1557, the New Testament, and then they completed it with the translation of the Old Testament in 1560. There were over 150 editions published between 1560 and 1644. The first printing in England by permission of Queen Elizabeth came in 1575 and 76. And it also was the first Bible that was ever printed in Scotland in 1579. I want to take a little closer look at that. And as you can see, that was the first edition, the 1560 first edition frontispiece. I want to talk a little bit about what this frontispiece means. It was a really interesting text. It did a lot of things. We call it a study Bible, the world's first study Bible. Somebody had a question about, well, what is a study Bible? What does that mean? Well, it means that this Bible was intended to be studied by individuals on their own. So it contained all sorts of things that help you study. The frontispiece itself tells you that it's the Bible and Holy Scriptures contained in the Old and New Testament, translated according to the Hebrew and Greek and conferred with the best translations in diverse languages, with most profitable annotations upon all the hard places, right? So annotations on the hard places. If you've ever been reading something and said, I don't really know what that means, the translators of the Geneva Bible have anticipated the parts that you might have trouble with and given you an explanation of that in the marginalia. And other things of great importance as may appear in the epistle to the reader. And you notice that in the first edition, it starts out with 2 epistles. One letter is a letter to Queen Elizabeth I, who had recently become the monarch and reinstated Protestantism to the Church of England. She'd retaken it back from Roman Catholic jurisdiction. And essentially, they were using this letter to her in this Bible to say, is it okay to come home now? But the other letter that they have is directly to the reader. It's not to a bishop. It's not to the priest in charge in the church. It's to the individual reader. You can see here where it talks about that it's translated according to the Hebrew and Greek. It's really doing that Lutheran and Calvinist work of emphasizing the primacy of Scripture from the original languages. It's an implicit contrast to the Catholic Bible, which was translated into Latin and read in Latin. So it's designed for this private devotional use. There are pictures, there are all sorts of, charts and graphs and marginalia and definitions. There's two concordances that came out along with it. And here on the very front page, the frontispiece, you have this picture and these quotations that draw a parallel between the Marian exile and the Israelites' flight from Egypt, right? Great are the troubles of the righteous, but the Lord delivereth them out of all, it says. You can picture the exile community in Geneva saying, yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. Let's put that on. And then they've got this picture of Moses and the Red Sea, and they're going to cross it into the Promised Land. So this is a really potent image for this community in exile that's looking for a home. Now, some of them eventually went to the American colonies and tried to set up a more pure religious state there. So another question that I get is, well, what's the relationship between the Geneva Bible and the King James Version? Otherwise known as, why did King James hate the Geneva Bible so much? Why did he want to replace it? What happened in that conversation? And here, a little reminder about, this is James, it's a portrait from 1605, and the frontispiece of the King James Version. It's a lovely image from the copy held by the Penn Library. So James worried about his overall control, not only of England and the church, but the church and the state. Remember, he's Scottish. He's not the son of Elizabeth I. There was a lot of controversy surrounding his coronation. You may remember that, more than one person tried to assassinate him. In fact, some people tried to blow him up along with Parliament in the Gunpowder Plot, right? That's why we have Guy Fawkes Day. Some people have Guy Fawkes Day. One of the big things about his dislike on it was this way that it was influenced by the republicanism of Geneva, right? He called it out actually in the Hampton Court Conference that he commanded the King James Version to be written at. He said, I think that of all English Bibles, that of Geneva is the worst, right? He said that it's fundamentally the annotations. The annotations he called very partial, untrue, seditious, and savoring too much of dangerous and traitorous conceits. The annotations, in particular, interpretations of certain biblical passages, anti-clerical republicanism, implying that church hierarchy was unnecessary, that therefore, there's not really a need for priesthood, and certainly not a supreme head of the church if you don't need a priesthood. So there's also a few passages where the Geneva translation refers to monarchs as tyrants, and the marginal notes really suggest that resisting such, as they say, overweening rulers is a perfectly good thing to do. Like, you shouldn't tolerate tyrants. And you can see here in chapter 3, this is the book of Micah, and it's the heading of chapter 3. In the Geneva version, which is the one above, it says, against the tyranny of princes and false prophets. And then in the 1611 King James Version below, they've changed that. It says chapter 3 is about the cruelty of the princes, the falsehood of the prophets, and the security of them both. And the argument is like, princes may be cruel, prophets may be wrong, but they are a very secure method of governing you, so put up with it. It is your job, right? The King James Version very much emphasized harmony and stuff, and he really demanded of his translators that the word tyranny never appear in the King James Version. Nonetheless, both texts were actually very heavily reliant on Tyndale's translation. And, you know, King James Version, it uses a lot of the ideas from Geneva's study materials. So in another generation or two, this ends up in the English Civil Wars, as I say, and you can see that it splits the government and it splits the church. The nonconformists, parliamentarians under Cromwell split with the royalists. Eventually, Charles I gets beheaded. So yeah, maybe he had a point about, you know, encouraging this whole republicanism. Here, we'll inflect it over to the Geneva Bibles of the Ramseyer collection. We've got several, and the story I want to tell about them is that every one of them tells a different story. So let's take a look. There we go. There's the 1595. There's a 1599, a 1607, a 1610, a Regent's Bible, which says it's 1640. And finally, this great big one, which is 1775. Wait, you say, didn't they stop getting printed in 1644? Yeah, and that's a great story, why we got big one. So let's look at the 1595 one. On these slides, I put the call number so that you can find them if you'd like to go back and look at them yourself. So here we go. This 1595, this is the oldest one that we have. And you can see it's got some ownership marks. This one's got an ownership mark from 1791. I'll talk a moment about the ownership marks after we finish looking at all of them, because they're quite interesting. Keep your eye on that though, your finger in it. We can see that it's missing its frontispiece. And so one of the things we often ask is, you know, how can you tell? It's missing it because it's been rebound. And you can see that every time they rebind them, they would shave off a little bit of the margins to make all the pages tidy and even. Somebody asked, do I do restoration on these? I don't. Although I do teach students how books are restored. I don't actually do the restoration myself, but we talk about bookbinding techniques and things like that. So here you can see what types of front material there are, and you can see here that there's an additional book of Psalms in the front. And again, this is the one that's used in churches. This is the Book of Common Prayer Psalms, not the Geneva Psalms, actually. And let's see, what am I looking at? Right. So there's a lot of material before you get to Book of Genesis. And here again, we see Book of Genesis starts, it's been rebound. So how do we tell? How do we tell what date it is if we don't actually have a frontispiece? Well, we can look at the frontispiece of the New Testament. Usually they're in there and they're in better shape. And from this frontispiece, we can see that at least the New Testament appears to be a 1595 version, right? Printed by Christopher Barker at London. And then you can see here that it's got the concordance materials and some more ownership marks, right? There's another 1595. Christopher Barker Christopher Barker and the Queen's Most Excellent Majesty. So this one's printed during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. It is printed by the father of the printer of the King James Version. And again, some ownership marks and another book of Psalms. So some of these Geneva Bibles, they had like not one, not two, but 3 books of Psalms, and they were all different. This is a metrical one, and it has the music that you would sing to also, right? So, you can see here how we really only know about this book from its New Testament. But that means that there are still things that we don't really know. We know it's been rebound, so when did the front material come in? When were the extra pages lost? Why was this printed in 1595? But the owners seem to be, reading it and writing their names on it in the late 18th century. So these are great questions. Is there a risk? And this is another thing that people ask us is how do you preserve them? How do you handle them? You see me touching them with my bare hands. And you may have seen in older documentaries or movies or things, people handling books in white gloves. That's no longer considered the best practice because the fibers on the gloves can snag on the fibers on the books. And you can see how that the edges of these are sort of rough, and there's a lot of little bumps and rough pieces. So you don't want the cloth on the glove to catch on the cloth of the page that could tear it. Your best, most sensitive, delicate implements are your actual fingertips. So the best practices are clean hands. Even when we touch an incredibly valuable book like Shakespeare First Folio, when it arrived, they're always telling us in these rare book rooms, clean hands. You wash your hands before you touch the books. And I also say you wash your hands afterwards, because while, yes, we don't want our hands to damage the books themselves, the ink has heavy metals in it. It's sometimes paints are a little bit toxic if they have cinnabar or mercury laden dyes in them. So you always want to wash your hands afterwards too. I mentioned that there are all these Psalms. And it's funny to think about how the Psalms themselves were the most lasting part of the Geneva Bible and its predecessors. We think of the Psalms of King James Version are some of the most beautiful poetry that was ever written in the English language. It's gorgeous. But they didn't use the King James Version of the Psalms until, really like the 1640s. So it's like a whole, almost 100 years that the Geneva versions were sort of bopping around, and even other versions. So in a text like the Geneva 1595, like I said, we have 3 different versions. There's the one from the Book of Common Prayer, and you can see, if you remember, maybe you learned the King James Version when you were a kid. I did. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leadeth me in the green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. Right? He restoreth my soul. It's so beautiful. But here you can see the differences. The Lord is my shepherd, therefore can I lack nothing. He shall feed me in a green pasture and lead me forth beside the waters of comfort. And then you can see the later Geneva version is, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to rest in green pasture and leadeth me by the still waters. And this is, you can see we're coming a little closer to the King James Version. So King James Version was very much influenced by the Geneva Version. But we have a third version too, right? The Metrical Psalms. And that was the book of Psalms that was like in the back that we saw. It's by Thomas Sternhold and John Hawkins and a few others. And they provided music and they put them into rhyme. So, the slightly earlier one is the one on your left. The Lord is only my support, and he that doth me feed. How can I then lack anything whereof I stand in need? And Thomas Sternhold's more famous translation, my shepherd is the living Lord, nothing therefore I need. In pastures fair with waters calm, he served for me to feed. That is the only one of Sternhold's translations of the Psalms that is still in common use. It's the one that people sing in the hymnal. And it's one of the last to appear in print. So our next text is the 1599 version, or Ramseyer number 37, if you want to come find it in the archive yourself, which we encourage. It is a public resource, as well as a great resource for students. You can see here in this edition that it has the clasps left on the cover. So it's an old cover, right? It's definitely a book that's in better shape. And you can see there's plenty of margin left. So it hasn't been rebound as often, right? The clasps are an old way that they used to have of keeping the book tidy. So it's in really lovely, lovely condition. In fact, we even have a frontispiece that is original, although you can see it has come loose to a certain extent, but it's a 1599 imprint, so it says, and it's got these very distinctive genealogies around it. It has elements from the Book of Common Prayer. You see to the Christian reader here with a table of contents, which is something that's kind of new for Bibles. And there's a chart here. That is a chart about how to take profit in reading the Holy Scriptures. This chart tells you the relationship of all the different parts of the Bible to each other. So this is one of the main elements of a study Bible. Like, what is it you're studying? How do you study it, right? And we're going to talk about that, the importance of that chart and the guy that wrote it last. But I want to point out that this 1599 edition, it's probably spurious. James I banned new printings of the Geneva Bible in 1616 when he realized that people weren't, by and large, buying the King James Version, right? King James Version came out. It cost a bunch. It cost like how much did I say it cost? King James cost 10 shillings, loose leaf, plus 2 to 5 shillings more for the binding. So when it first is published, this is like 3 or 4 months' wages for working and even middle-class families. The King James Version is big. It weighs like 15 to 20 pounds, whereas these are small. As you can see, they're quarto size. You can hold them in your hands and read them. So when I say that it wasn't just the Puritan Bible, it really wasn't. Anglicans loved this Bible. Queen Elizabeth loved this Bible. Scottish people loved it. Everybody was buying the Geneva version. It only costs, perhaps 2 or 3 shillings. It was not expensive at all. So he banned new printings, and that ban remained in place until his death in 1625. So the enterprising Robert Barker, who was the printer of the King James Version, but who wasn't making nearly enough money off the King James Version, decided to keep printing the now banned Geneva Version. He just put his father's name on it, and you can see this is by the deputies of Christopher Barker, right? Printer at the Queen, the Queen's Most Excellent Majesty in 1599. There's enough plausible deniability that you could sell it and not get in trouble. But it's not the real thing. We can see the real thing next. We don't have a real one, but if you look at a frontispiece comparison, this is to the left, an authentic 1599 printing from the Early English Books Online, which is a great service that our library offers, right, this online archive of that. And then this spurious 1599 printing, which is from the Ramseyer collection. There are so many more printings of the spurious version that certainly they are very much not all printed in 99. The other thing that you can tell about our 1599 printing edition that we have is that it was certainly rebound. And when they rebound it, they added that book of Metrical Psalms, and you can see that it was printed in 1643. So, quite a long time after the 1599 printing. It's inserted there and sewn in with the new binding. Now here is the 1607, and I've got quotations around that date because I'm not so sure about it. So this is call number 1528, and we can roll that one. So here you see it's beautiful. Again, there's some gilding on the cover. It's a nice leather-bound book, and inside we have many ownership marks. The earliest is from 1797. No, actually we have some earlier ones than that. But these in this hand are from the 18th and 19th century, about 100 years in there. We'll return to why that is later on. And you can see that this writing, I can see that this writing is actually written with metal nib pen, whereas much of the other writing is not. So you can see that there's a number of ownership marks and the concordances. Now, the date that we get, the sole date that we have for this 1607 version comes from actually the concordance, not from either of the frontispieces, because we don't have either of the frontispieces to the Old Testament or the New Testament in this particular volume. So we're counting on the idea that the concordance is of the same vintage as the text itself, which it might be. We see here in the front matter, there are certain questions and answers touching the doctrine of predestination, which marks it as very much a Puritan text, right? This is whoever put that one together was a Calvinist and want to talk about predestination. So 1610, or call number 36. This is a text that is from just before the creation of the King James Version. And you can see these lovely genealogies that it starts with. And this ownership mark, John Sanders, and that was definitely written with a feather quill and walnut ink. And I hope someday to talk more about these processes. For those of you who are interested in restoration binding, you can see that these were sewn in separately. We don't know if they're of the same vintage, but the damage to the book is extensive. They were fixed. That's a modern fix or a more contemporary fix. Perhaps not how I would have fixed it, but that's okay. And you can see that even though it says it's from 1610, whoever is using this, the priest ultimately that was using this, took out the word James and wrote Charles in. So this was used straight through 1625 and apparently in church. And you can see the front materials, these psalms, how they're arranged into morning prayers, evening prayers, right, to aid priests in their delivery of liturgy and the services, church services. The headers on this lovely Geneva edition, or this edition, show you what day you're on from the first day of the month all the way to the 30th day of the month, right? So it's helpful if you're a priest, but again, it's showing that it's being used in churches despite injunctions against it. So definitely used after 1625 when Charles becomes king. And you can see here that the priest that was using it even marked some of his favorite psalms. So these are the stories that you can see from it. Here is the New Testament frontispiece. And again, this is where we get the date 1610. And through the end, though, you can see that the concordances were printed in 1611. So, different print years, different imprint years. And the book of Psalms at the end of it, the Metrical Psalms, this one was printed in 1612. So you have 1610, 1611, 1612, all in one book. It makes me wonder, were they all bought together and then bound together the first time, or did they get added? It's unclear. We don't know these particulars of the story, but the way that it's put together with the metrical psalms, with the types of ownership marks and the type of marginalia, it certainly seems to indicate that one of the stories of this text was that it was used by an Anglican priest for church services as well as for individual devotional study. Finally, for our smaller books, the 1640 edition, and I've got big quotations around that because it's kind of a Franken Bible. This is volume 30, number 38 in our collection. Let's take a look at what we've got here. So when we start the video, you'll see that when it was rebound in the modern contemporary period, the person who rebound it really wanted to know that it's Geneva Bible. Sometimes Geneva Bible is called the Breeches Bible. So it says Breeches Bible on it. It has a 1640 frontispiece and a first page of Genesis that matches that, but it's missing its front matter. And there's two types of text. There's black letter text throughout a lot of it, but it doesn't match the 1640 imprint and the first page of Genesis. It's missing its New Testament frontispiece, right? It has concordances that are of a different era. So let's take a look at this Bible. And these are the questions that I really encourage my students to think about. So we see here, it really wants us to know that this is a Breeches Bible. So whoever rebound it had a particular interest in this translation. It's in good shape, but you can tell it's been rebound by the size of the margins. And there's our date, 1640. Fine. We have some early ownership marks, 1667. Again, interesting and fine, right? Some quite early ownership marks in walnut ink with a feather quill as a writing implement. And here you see the first page of the book of Genesis. It's heavily damaged though. And you can see that the frontispiece has been glued there. It's glued to the first book. So it wasn't part of the original quire of sewn materials, right? They didn't glue the books together. They sewed them together. So I am not even positive that frontispiece was part of the first page of Genesis that it came from. You can tell it's been manipulated somehow. And then here, this page is in Roman font, and that page is in black letter font. So they're in two different fonts. They're obviously different printings. So somebody cobbled them together to make themselves a whole book. Right. Again, you can see some earlier use marks. Again, this is with a feather quill and walnut ink. I would love to do one of these sessions on historic calligraphy and writing methods. And then we've got this concordance that's by Robert Barker, printer of the Queen's Most Excellent Majesty. So it has to have been published and printed before 1603. because that was last year of Queen Elizabeth's reign. It's referring to a queen. So we don't know. It's a sort of a mystery why we have so many different elements in that book and who put it together and why. One of our interesting moments for it, though, is that it's very enthusiastic about it being a breeches Bible. One of the highlights, the features of Geneva text was not only its continual use of the word tyrant and tyranny to, stick it to that guy, but also that in Genesis 3:7, it translates the term as breaches. So I put all sorts of translations here. I am not a Hebrew scholar, but I take it on good authority that the Hebrew word that it's trying to translate means something like the thing you put around your middle. The Latin Vulgate translation, the Catholic Bible, translates it as perizonata, right? The thing you put around your middle, right? The perizone thing. And the King James Version translates it as aprons because it was very offended by breeches. Geneva puts in breeches and everybody lost their minds. It was a very fighty term to use because breeches are men's garments. Those are breeches. These are the parade garments of Elector Moritz of Saxony. Again, contemporary garments to the creation of this Bible. So what were they thinking of when they were thinking breeches? They were thinking it looked like this. These things. They're specifically a garment for men. And it was very controversial that both Adam and Eve wore them because it seems to violate the injunction against cross-dressing in Deuteronomy 22:5. I will caution all of us, though, that reading the Torah out of context is very, very tricky. Deuteronomy is part of the books of the law, and in its original cultural context, with respect to the other passages in the Torah that regard gender, especially gender normativity and ritual cleanliness, it might not really mean that cross-dressing is right out. There are a lot of other scholarly and historically informed readings of that don't mean that it's an injunction against cross-dressing. So this is a huge part of why it's so exciting to read historic texts, because there's so many different routes into it and so many different reactions throughout history. So if you've ever heard it called a breeches Bible, that is why. Now, our last edition is this Folio Edition, and it's from 1775, and you may have been bothered by that, as I was bothered by that, because I knew that the last known edition of Geneva was printed in 1644. So why this? It's also enormous. This book is a similar size to the King James Version, and it was printed late, so late, almost a contemporary of the birth of our great nation, the United States of America. But that gives you a clue to what was going on here. This text, this edition, comes from the great age of evangelicalism, pietism, and the Great Awakening. It's an 18th century text, and you can see the beautiful 18th century neoclassical style of engravings, the art in there. And again, it's showing the old and new together. It's just a beautiful text, right? It's got a word about, its printers. I will come back to that. It's got a series of prefaces. So this is called Archbishops Parker's Preface. And this is why some people call it the Bishop's Bible. Archbishop Parker wasn't the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1775. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury in like 1600. He was Queen Elizabeth I Archbishop, right? So it's making historical argument about continuity. And we have this letter to the reader by this T. Grassup, right, who was the author of that chart. So he's one of the original contributors of Geneva study materials. So these are making a strong argument. Now, how far did her radicalism and reprinting in Geneva in the middle of the 18th century go? Not all the way. They translated back into aprons. So there's still tyranny, but there are no breaches. And it's just full of these beautiful engravings. I could spend a year just studying this edition. It's so interesting. Now, we can see how like it's in great shape, and we can think a little bit about what it's for. I gave away some of the game when I say she put aprons and not breeches, because the printer of this is a woman, Mary Lewis. The M in M. Lewis is for Mary, a printer, one of the foremost printers of nonconformist literature of her age. She occupied the printing house at number one, Paternoster Row. And if you read about historic London, Paternoster Row was like the premier street for the printers. Kind of like Savile Row was the premier street for the tailors. Paternoster Row is all the printers were. So she holds a prominent place on the street itself. She has printed this Bible. Why has she printed it? Because she herself is a dissenter. She was a bookseller, a printer, a nonconformist, an evangelical. She had joined the Moravian Church in 1749 with her husband, and then he died, her husband, who was also a printer, in 1755. But upon his death, she assumed control of that business, and with her two daughters, Catherine and Martha, she kept going. And in fact, she made it a much more influential printing house than it had been under her husband. He was known for sort of like niche little books, but she became known as the printer of the Moravian Church. Right? They had joined it in the year that the Moravian Church was recognized by the British Parliament in 1749. And she really concentrated on making herself the premier publisher of nonconformist materials. So for another 3.5 decades, those three women ran this shop and continued this tradition of printing nonconformist materials for the Great Awakening and its audiences in the late 18th century unabated. And this is the moment that ties together all of the Genevas in our collection, because you've noticed that so many of them have these dates by their owners, 1771, 1776, 1791, right? They're all in that, they all seem to have written their names within, I don't know, like 25 years of each other in these books from very diverse places. But you can see that they all got their hands on Geneva Bibles during the Great Awakening. They were part of a new evangelicalism, a new pietism in America and in England that took place at this time. So, this Bible, this revivalist Geneva is very much part of that story of the Great Awakening. And it shows how the communities of faith, they keep using these materials, right? They reuse them. They find a use for them in their own vernaculars. So that's what I have to say about these, and I hope that we'll have a bit of time for conversation.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. Twu, for that thorough presentation. We are going to transition to some live question and answers. I know that we are over the hour, but if folks would like to hang on, we do have a few questions and some time that we can take those. So we will start our videos. Perfect. Well, one question came in that is very exciting, and I think we'll just kick it off with that. One of our attendees actually has a 1610 Geneva Bible, and they're wondering, one, if it's valuable, and two, what should they do with it?
I don't know if it's valuable because I haven't seen it. Generally speaking, Geneva texts are interesting and they are old, but they're not particularly rare. Partially, they're not particularly rare because so many were printed. Even a text, and there's a book people, archive people, we often have this conversation about books, which is uncomfortable, but just because it's old doesn't mean it's rare. Just because it's valuable doesn't mean it's rare. Right? For instance, the Shakespeare First Folio. This is one of the books that more people studied more times ever. It is extraordinarily valuable. A first folio of Shakespeare's work went up on auction, 7 or 8 years ago, and sold for like $5 million. It's extremely valuable. But with something like 255 first folios that are whole and extant in the world, it's not actually rare. It's just valuable. Likewise, the King James Version, a pristine King James first edition is genuinely old, super interesting, very beautiful, but there were so many, many, many of them, more even made than Shakespeare's First Folio, that I think even the most complete, most beautiful volumes still only tend to auction for scales of like tens of thousands rather than millions. And Geneva is another sort of magnitude, like order of magnitude less at auction than King James versions. Again, because there are so many of them. A 1660 first edition is worth more and will auction more and is slightly rarer than a 1610. A 1599 is highly suspect because it's probably spurious, right? So it's impossible to say. And a lot of the question about how valuable it is will have to do with what shape it's in, what kind of condition it's in, how many times it's been rebound, how sure we are that the frontispiece is original to the text so that we really know what date it is. As we saw for a lot of our texts, we kind of think we know, but we're not positive. That's what makes these superb study texts for students, because they get to come to the mysteries and explore the questions and the problems. And they get to ask, hey, so how do we know? And I'll say, well, how would you know? And, then we have a whole class saying, well, I guess we can look up, the catalog of the publisher, find out how many they printed in that year. Many of those records are available. That's how we know that the Geneva Bible that Mary Lewis printed is, by her lights, a Geneva Bible. It's in her catalog, along with 338 other texts that she printed. Right? I don't know. Does that answer? I hope.
Yeah, and I think for this viewer, if we can connect offline too and perhaps you and her can talk a little bit more about that.
Right.
You had mentioned students. And so how do students use this collection in their learning? I know you were touching base a little bit on that, but can you elaborate a little bit more?
Well, sometimes we use it for language study, like linguistics. I teach a history of language class, and I get them in here, and it's a fantastic resource because I can say, all right, everyone, let's take the opening passage of the Gospel according to John and look at it in, across the course of 600 years. So we'll pick a Bible from each 100-year period, right? And see how the English language changed, right? How the spelling changed, how the presentation in print changed. We can even look earlier because we have some modern printings of the Anglo-Saxon Bible, right? So we can look at it in Anglo-Saxon, we can look at it in the Elizabethan English, we can look at it in Tyndale's English, we can look at it in the English of the 1640s, and they change. So that's one way that we can use them for a class that's entirely unrelated to the content of the books, just looking at language change. We also use them in classes on material book culture and book history. We look at type of binding styles, the type of illustration styles, the way that the information in these texts is packaged. For instance, what kind of apparatuses do they contain? What kind of headers, of footers, marginalia, where do you say tyrant? Where do you not say tyrant? Right, so there's that other way that we use them. One of my graduate courses used the collection to think about how the different eras of Christianity contributed to the different eras of literature. So I asked them to study a text that contained allusions to Christian scripture. The course was called The Bible in Literature, and I teach an undergraduate version too. But for the graduate students, they were encouraged to find texts that use biblical scriptural content. And then I asked them to find a text in the collection that was created and printed 5 to 10 years before that text that they are reading was printed and published. And to match up the type of language that you see, the type of very specific cultural concerns that both texts present in their very forms. So, one of them was looking at some Caribbean literature and found that the collection contains a Bible in Gullah. Right? One of them was reading Toni Morrison and discovered that our collection contains books in African American vernacular English. Right? There were all sorts of things. One of them was interested in new media and just the visual language of these fantastic monsters in video games, and discovered these editions of like illustrated editions of the Bible that had these phantasmagoric etchings by Doré, and was able to make this very, I think, like spot on visual lineage from the one to the other.
Very interesting, all the overlap. And I know that we could go on for a little longer, but I think just to be conscious of time, we will end it on that note. I guess the collection is available for the community to view, correct? if they were to schedule an appointment, or can folks stop into the library to see the collection? Maybe we can end on that note.
They should contact, if you would like to look at materials in collection or work with them, you should definitely contact Amy Brown, who is the UMD Archivist and who works with the collection and can help set you up in a reading room, right? Because obviously the collection doesn't leave the library, but she will help you use the collection.
And actually, Amy just added some information in the chat box. So there's an email there if you would like to schedule an appointment. So you can follow those instructions. Well, thank you again, Dr. Twu, for taking the time to share with us this important piece of history. We appreciate just all the knowledge and all the detail. Again, there were probably other questions that weren't answered today. So on the screen here, you'll see a couple different emails for Dr. Twu, the library, and our office, Alumni Relations. So feel free to reach out with your questions, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. So again, a big thanks, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.